Okay, thanks very much for gathering again today. Today I'm going to talk about how constitutionalism and the incentives set up by different types of constitution, real-world constitutions, affect incentives to delegate to independent agencies and incentives for how those regimes are structured. So we start to come a bit closer to reality. I'll say something at the end about utility regulation, and then something more important about securities regulation, which will bridge to tomorrow, where all I will talk about tomorrow is central banking. And to give a little bit of a preview for tomorrow, and also to tease members of the faculty who can't be here tomorrow. Tomorrow I will do, amongst other things, I'll offer three arguments about monetary independence. One, I will address the argument from my friend Larry Summers and others that monetary independence is no longer needed because the battle against inflation is won. Secondly, I will offer an argument for monetary independence based on the values of constitutionalism, specifically the separation of powers. And thirdly, I will turn on its head the normal political science story of why in the real world politicians choose to delegate to independent monetary authorities. Where interestingly, given that political science kind of aims to be completely realistic, I think one of its dominant stories about central bank independence is slightly naive about the nature of politics. So today, constitutionalism. What does a constitution do? And by the way, given that I'm English, British, for any of you sitting there thinking, well, they don't have a written constitution. We do still have constitutional principles, and they even end up in our Supreme Court occasionally. Constitutions shape the structure of government. They place limits on what government can do. And in this, in both of those senses, they introduce veto points. Who can veto legislative measures? And famously, the United States has lots and lots of veto points. In consequence, it is hard for the US to pass laws, and having passed a law, it is hard for the US to repeal or amend the law. And this is going to be pretty important for where we're going, and it shapes the incentives not only of the executive branch and the legislative branch, but actually it also, I would argue, shapes the incentives of the courts, of the judges as well. So famously in this country, judges will defer. It's an interesting use of words, but it's always the word used, will defer on some points of law to administrative agencies. Whereas in civil law jurisdictions, all points of law have always been reserved for the courts. And although the UK is a common law jurisdiction, that has been the tradition in the United Kingdom and has in fact been legal doctrine since the late 1960s. So one of the kind of interesting things, if you compare Europe as a whole with the United States, is that points of law will be decided by the courts rather than the courts deferring to administrative agencies, including our independent agencies. And why should that be? Why should that happen in the United States? Because it sounds as though this is kind of some deeply principled thing, and I'm not convinced it is at all. It's that if you, the Supreme Court, decide a point of law, and it is out of line with what either politicians in Congress or the executive branch or everybody else for that matter thinks should be the proper application of that particular statutory provision, it is very, very hard to change the law. So this is not the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution. This is the Supreme Court as the final court of appeal for ordinary law. In the United Kingdom, almost the opposite is the case. If the courts interpret a contract or a statute in ways that reflect kind of obvious meaning of the words on the page, but seem pretty crazy in terms of public policy. If there is immediate and major damage to the welfare of the country, Parliament will repeal, will amend the law and correct the legal position pretty quickly, and that has happened in finance occasionally over the past 30 or so years, famously in the case of a swaps problem in the 1990s. Yes, the early 1990s. So what I want to get across is that incentives matter for how all of the branches of the state conduct themselves. So on to the administrative state, this phalanx of independent agencies, semi-independent agencies, and others. So most constitutions don't say anything about the administrative state. Kind of behind that, if you think in this country about the great debates between Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison, there is no discussion of delegated power whatsoever other than powers delegated to the president. There's no conceptual space for what actually amounts to most of government today. And this is kind of strange for us, because if you go back to the debates in Europe largely, before the Madison and Hamiltonian discussions, people like Locke and Montesquieu were focused exactly on the structure of the state. Montesquieu is a kind of early political scientist, writing about the separation of powers as he sees it in the real world in the UK and France and Germany and elsewhere. Locke is absolutely engaged with who should hold power in government, and yet that's something that is missing not only in political theory over the last 100 years or so, but actually in our constitutions, with one exception in the advanced economy democratic world, which is Germany. And the reason, of course, is that Germany's basic law was written after the Second World War, and so is written after the administrative state has started to emerge. But the basic law is interesting because it makes no room for independent agencies whatsoever. It says that all administration shall be under the control of ministers. It says, and actually it articulates two kinds of ministerial control. And for those of you that are most interested in central banking, constitutional lawyers used to debate whether the Bundesbank was an independent agency or not. Certainly it's not unambiguously independent in the basic law and couldn't be. Its de jure independence was put beyond doubt only by the Maastricht Treaty, the EU treaty, that demanded the central banks of the member states of the euro area make their central bank independent. And the German Constitutional Court, on both this front and one or two things since, has had to read the basic law in the light of the European treaties. What I've just said about Germany is going to matter a lot tomorrow when I talk about the debates on whether central banks should be banking supervision, given that the Bundesbank in Germany are probably the loudest and most powerful voice that the central bank should not be the supervisor. And this isn't just to do with welfare economics, it's to do with a view of how constitutions work. France, it has a constitution which has been amended quite regularly over the years, hence the Fifth Republic, and actually it made such substantive amendments, I think in 2008, you could almost call it the 5.5 Republic at the moment. Its written constitution provides that all administration should be under the control of the Prime Minister, but the words are rather ambiguous, and the Constitutional Court carved out a space for independent agencies insulated from government and said they shall be. Where an agency is intended to be independent, it shall be insulated from day-to-day control. In fact, France is interesting because over the past decade or so, it has probably had the richest debate about how independent agencies fit in to our politics and scheme of government. The Senate produced a report a few years ago, I think 2014-15, that said independent agencies were absolutely horrible, terrible things. I mean, I'm exaggerating somewhat, of course, and that led to a kind of rather more moderate piece of legislation produced in the Assembly that caused a few agencies, their independence was taken away, and laid down a generic structure for how independent agencies should fit into the structure of government. In the UK, given the doctrine of parliamentary accountability, which is very, very deep in our soft norms as well as in our legal norms, for a long time it was regarded as anathema to have independent agencies. When the Labour government, the Blair-Brown government, made the Bank of England independent in 1997, the Tory party opposition voted against it, precisely on the grounds that it was against the traditions of parliamentary accountability. And that debate had been going on for about a decade. I remember in the late 80s or early 90s, there were public reports by independent people, Small I for Independent, on whether or not the Bank of England should be independent and how to get over this hurdle of parliamentary accountability. And there was one kind of fascinating and funny moment, which sadly I can't find recorded, where somebody said, well, actually, we could call the governor to the bar of the House. If you've seen television coverage of Parliament at Prime Minister's Question Time, there is a bar at the end of the floor. And the answer came, yes, but we've only ever done that with criminals over the centuries, and the governor of the bank isn't necessarily a criminal. In fact, this problem was solved in the 1990s through the growth of select committees, which happened under Mrs. Thatcher, although Mrs. Thatcher herself wasn't a great fan of the select committees. And the select committees have increased the power of our parliamentary backbenches a lot. So on to the United States, which is what I want to speak mainly about today. The administrative state is not provided for explicitly in the Constitution, and there is a minority of scholars and public intellectuals who will argue that the administrative state is unconstitutional. A man called Philip Hamburger wrote a pretty successful book 2 or 3 years ago called Is the Administrative State Unlawful? Or it may have been, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? And this is a kind of minority position here, but it's a minority position that thrives more than any similar sentiment on the other side of the Atlantic. Notwithstanding that minority view, the court, the Supreme Court, has allowed the administrative state to exist. And big picture, it's allowed it to exist on the condition that agencies within the administrative state, with independent or not independent, should be governed by statutes, legislation that incorporates an intelligible principle. And I put that in quotes because it is the language used in law, and because it will turn out to need quotes, because the words turn out not to be the normal words of the English language, but terms of art, and this matters. The other thing that the court has determined back in the 1930s, arguably earlier, is that Congress can pass laws, statutes that shield the policymakers of an agency from being sacked without cause on a whim by the president. This dates back in particular to a case where President Roosevelt sacked a member of, I think, the Federal Trading Commission because they didn't agree on policy, and the court effectively reinstated the member, or actually allowed the member to draw a pension, I think. And this, by the way, is how the term independent agency, again in quotes, is used in the United States. It tends to mean the rather narrow legal point that the president can't sack the policymakers. Something else that's worth saying about legal doctrine here is that agencies are regarded as part of the executive branch, or more narrowly, they are regarded as exercising the executive power created by the Constitution. And that's because the Constitution says that all legislation shall be passed by Congress, or federal legislation will be passed by Congress. And so we're in a world of Alice in Wonderland here, because those agencies that issue legally binding rules are obviously legislating in some respect. And what matters is how far they've been constrained by Congress, or whether they are really just filling in the details. The doctrine is they are filling in the details. So let's see whether they are. And I'm going to go over some agencies that are semi-independent, as I've described it. Remember, that means the president can't sack the policymakers, but they have to go to Congress each year for money. Executive agencies, they are under presidential control. He can get up in the morning and just sack the boss. He may not do so because he'd have to get their replacement confirmed in the Senate, but he can, or she can. And then independent agencies that are insulated day to day from both. And part of the point I'm going to make is that all these objectives are vague, and there doesn't seem to be any difference in the way that Congress and the court treat agencies with different degrees of insulation from politics, which you will have realized that I think is a pretty big mistake. So the Communications Commission, which is a standard New Deal type regulatory commission, semi-independent, it's to pursue the public convenience, interest, or necessity, and so as to provide a fair, efficient, and equitable distribution of, in the example I've pulled out, of radio services. Well, there's no monitorable standard there. The Energy Regulatory Commission, to ensure that utility-type charges are just and reasonable. So, you five over there are going to be the commission. You're going to have a debate about what just is reasonable. You may not agree, but you can have a vote, and what you decide will be just and reasonable, subject only to challenge in the courts, and in particular the appeal courts may not agree with you, and they may prefer to substitute their own policy. The EPA, an executive agency under presidential control, to set a policy for air pollutants requisite to protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. So you're going to have to interpret what margin means, and you're going to have to make a judgment about what adequate means. The EPA director is over here somewhere. And it's got a secondary requirement to deliver policies requisite to protect the public welfare. So you're going to have to interpret requisite, protect, and public welfare. I think you can probably interpret public welfare as a compound, and then you're going to have to make some judgments over there. The SEC, which is a semi-independent New Deal commission, to deliver I haven't used the exact quote, this is taken from the mission statement, that the SEC issued to kind of summarize the statutory provision, to deliver a combination of investor protection, fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and capital formation. And I will come back to them at the end. And so you've got some trade-offs. Here I'm introducing something else. This is both, each one is vague, and there are multiple objectives, and so you're going to have to trade them off, and you've been given no guidance how to do so. The SEC is in the second row over there. And the Federal Reserve Board, not in its monetary policy function, but in its banking supervision function, is required to ensure the safety and soundness of banking groups. And actually, interestingly, bridging to tomorrow, safety and soundness are always interpreted as a compound in this country. When we reformed the position in the United Kingdom, in truth partly because of me, we first of all we asked Parliament to specify safety and soundness in terms of financial stability, and there is a clause for safety and there is a clause for soundness, one about the life of banks and one about the death of banks. So it seems to me that kind of by any ordinary standard, so the standard of citizens, these agencies, all of them, are doing more than fill in the details. They're determining high policy. So it's not obvious that any of these statutes provide an intelligible principle. Now, I talked about this to a famous constitutional lawyer in this country who absolutely insisted to me, vehemently, in fact, that in each case, there was an intelligible principle. But of course, this person meant it as a term of art, because since the court has not struck out the delegations, and since the court's doctrine is that there shall be an intelligible principle, well, then there must have been an intelligible principle, and since there must have been, there was an intelligible principle. But this is intelligible principle in quotes. Whereas my point is not about legality, which the court can determine. My point is about legitimacy, which goes, I argue, beyond legality. And so these words, intelligible principle, don't mean the English language words intelligible principle, or actually the same concepts translated into any other language. This is not a point about the peculiarities of my tongue. Of course, what's going on here is that Congress has incentives to shift blame away from itself onto unelected bureaucrats. And the court has incentives not to close down the administrative state by striking out lots of delegations to administrative agencies. And I mean, there's the battle between the Roosevelt administration and the Supreme Court in the 1930s into the 1940s is an extraordinary story in this respect. Initially, the court are striking out some delegations, and then that's when Roosevelt threatens to pack the court, and there's a kind of great excitement. This is a wonderful thing to read about, to understand American 20th century history. And both sides retreat, and the court partly retreats by allowing lots of delegations, vague delegations, to go ahead. Then, as I've said, that leaves the lower courts, particularly the appeal courts, and arguably below, with incentives to interpret vague objectives to pursue their own notion, political notion of what public policy should be. Now, part of the difficulty here, in my view, in terms of my concern with independent agencies, is the failure to distinguish between executive agencies, what I call semi-independent agencies, and independent agencies. And that would be true in Britain as well. And to some extent, it's almost by definition true in Germany, since there are no independent agencies de jure in Germany. And France does make a few distinctions. And the degree of insulation, so that pushes us to the question, well, is the degree of insulation that each of these agencies have itself principled, or is it just the balance, a product of the balance of forces, the veto points, and the incentives of the various actors? And of course, it's the second. So under united government, by which I mean when the same party holds the presidency and a majority in the Senate and a majority in the House, typically, this is an empirical point, when a new agency is created, it will be an executive agency under presidential control, because Congress will defer to the wishes of the president, which is to keep things close to him or one day her. Occasionally, as with the CFPB, when there's unified government here, you get a properly independent agency created as an attempt by that particular party to embed their policy, and that's what happened with the CFPB. But as I've said, the CFPB doesn't satisfy my principles for creating an independent agency. This is just a kind of political move. But almost never under united government will you get a standard regulatory commission, a semi-independent agency. When you get to divided government, you often get these semi-independent agencies because Congress wants to retain some power, some day-to-day control for itself, which it does through the annual budget appropriations, and it wants that without the president having parallel control. There are exceptions to that, though, because it depends on who most wants the measure, and famously, divided government in the early 1970s, a Republican president and essentially a Democrat Congress. The Democrats wanted an environmental agency. Nixon went along with that, but the price he or his team extracted was for it to be an executive agency. So this is just the kind of, this is power, but it's not power exercised in a principal way. So one of the things I want to promote is the idea that the non-delegation doctrine of there being an intelligent principle should be given substance for properly independent agencies insulated from both branches. And I think, and that for those agencies, as I've argued, I think there being an intelligible principle means there being a monitorable objective. And that's not going to happen unless, over time, people demand the court shifts its doctrine and starts to distinguish between agencies with different degrees of independence. Now, the big thing going on here is, in kind of more general terms, is that there is a tension between incentive compatibility, kind of one of the great concepts of economics, and values compatibility. What I've been describing is an incentives compatible world, where the agencies get a degree of independence that by and large, not in every case, by and large, is ex ante and ex post compatible with the incentives of all the various actors. But I don't think it's values compatible, and I think that is quite a problem, because what you get is an administrative state with a structure that leaves many people on both the left of politics and the right of politics, or people that don't take any position on the standard set of issues, kind of fed up with Washington, how Washington, in this case, how Washington allocates power. Now let me just offer two examples. Yesterday I gave some examples, I think, from antitrust and prudential supervision. Today I'm going to give some examples from utility regulation, and then what I think is a big incipient problem in securities regulation. And then I'll finish with a matrix, because we're in a business school, and so you have to have a matrix eventually. Also, so HBS told me. So maybe you don't have matrices. You're so smart here, maybe you don't have simplified matrices in Chicago. So utility regulation suffers from a standard, in fact, a special kind of credible commitment problem, which is that you need big investment with long horizons to have, for an economy to have good utility infrastructure. This is a form of infrastructure expenditure. And of course, the government, the state, wants people to make those investments, and so will kind of promise not, I'm going to use the words loosely, tax them in a particularly heavy way. But once the investment has been made, then in the short run at least, the government has incentives to change course and actually tax via regulation or whatever, and extract some rents. And so this is one of the reasons that alongside monetary policy, utility regulation is typically delegated to independent agencies. And whereas in the United States, where this happened much earlier, it just happened because of expertise. In Europe, it was typically articulated on these grounds, plus the need after the wave of privatization, but where governments retained a minority stake in utility service providers in some countries to separate regulation from ownership. But here's an interesting thing about power. And I'm going to offer a contrast between France and the United Kingdom. So in some countries, there is not only regulation of the economics of the telecoms market, the media market, but there is also some regulation of content. And the nature of that content regulation varies enormously from over time and from country to country. That's not what my point's going to be about. It's, should you combine, can you decently combine the regulation of content, which if you like is a form of censorship, with the regulation of the economics, the economic regulation? And France's answer to that was no. You definitely can't, and you shouldn't, because the resulting agency will be too powerful. And I think this debate happened not only in politics, it happened in the Conseil d'Etat. In Britain, the economics regulator of telecom and media, which is called Ofcom, is the content regulator, and last year became the regulator of the BBC, the Public Broadcast Corporation. And one of the things that surprised me about this, a former colleague of mine, who's now the chair of the BBC Governors, wrote a report on how the BBC should be regulated. And what surprised me was that no one talked about, would this make Ofcom, a body with essentially one policymaker, and I'm not making an ad feminem point about the woman who leads it, would this make them too powerful? My instinct is that it does, but my greater concern is that there was no debate about this whatsoever. The second example comes from securities regulation. And here what I want to argue is that something that has worked well for many years is not adequate to the challenges that we face today after the financial crisis. And I also want to argue that this problem manifests itself in different ways in different jurisdictions. So the SEC's objective, statutory objective, as I've already said, is protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly and efficient markets, and facilitating capital formation. And there are plenty trade-offs there that you can strike, and the new president has appointed a new head of the SEC who has announced that he plans to give more weight to capital formation than his predecessor. And remember, of course, that the SEC is not a completely independent agency. The UK's Financial Conduct Authority, which is an independent agency, has a strategic objective of ensuring that financial markets function well. That's kind of pretty vague. And then it's got three equally ranked operational objectives: securing an appropriate degree of protection for consumers. So there you've got to interpret securing appropriate degree protection and consumer. Are participants in wholesale markets consumers? Actually, the legislation makes it pretty clear that they are. Protecting and enhancing the integrity of the financial system. Does integrity cover financial stability? I argued when I was in office that it did. If it doesn't, the FCA has has limited statutory basis for taking into account financial stability at all. And promoting effective competition in the interests of consumers. So no standard set and no weighting is given for trading off the operational objectives. And it seems to me that that would be perfectly reasonable for non-independent agencies, executive agencies under direct ministerial cabinet control, or for a semi-independent agency that has to go back to Parliament or Congress, frequently more like the SEC structure than the FSA structure. But what about their role in stability? We argued yesterday that stability is a function which we could argue, well, there's a settled preference that we don't really like in stability, and what's more, that committing to a policy to maintain stability is hard, because when a boom comes, a credit boom or an asset price boom, on the whole, people like that until it bursts, and it's difficult to expect a policy agency that is under day-to-day control or influence from either elected branch of government to stick to an unpopular policy of leaning against the bubble or making the system more resilient. So you might expect the FCA to be better at that than the SEC. So how about this as a kind of loose syllogism? If monetary policies and monetary authorities are independent so as to help solve society's problem of making credible commitments to maintain stability, and if at least in the wake of the financial crisis, securities regulators are integral to maintaining financial stability, which I'm going to assert they are, given that this, how much financial intermediation is regulated not by central banks, but by market regulators, then securities regulators need, in their stability role, the same degree of independence as monetary authorities, and to be subject to the same kind of constraints, namely a monitorable objective and everything else. And that is not true anywhere, with the possible exception of ESMA in the EU. And this is going to come back to haunt us in the real world. this will contribute to the next financial crisis. So finishing off what I have to say today, the headline's a bit misleading. I keep on kind of slipping backwards and forwards between welfare and legitimacy. Now, actually, achieving welfare for the people is a necessary component for legitimacy, but doesn't exhaust its requirements. So here I want to say that we have the following 5 possible outcomes when we delegate powers to an agency of the administrative state. If it's delegated to an independent agency and the principles, my principles for delegation or something like them are satisfied, then it looks as though we have democratically legitimate welfare enhancement. If we've delegated to an independent agency and they don't satisfy the principles, but they could satisfy the principles, then we have a legitimacy problem, but a legitimacy problem that can be remedied, certainly by the legislature, and actually the agency itself can mitigate the problem. If we've delegated to an independent agency and the principles can't remotely be satisfied, and I've given examples of that over the past 2 days, then we just have a legitimacy problem that cannot be remedied. And I would expect that in slow motion to damage confidence in government. But on the other side of the ledger, if we have an agency under political control that could satisfy the principles, then we are probably sacrificing welfare because we are not reaping the benefits of credibly committing to a policy that could be framed in a monitorable way. And then, of course, if we have something under political control and it could not, the field could not ever satisfy the principles, then we have a sensible outcome. So we live in a world where there are some welfare sacrifices being made and there are some legitimacy risks being taken. And I'm choosing my words carefully. I think the welfare sacrifices are very likely to occur. The legitimacy risks may not crystallize. And this is because we haven't taken enough care with the design of the administrative state in almost any of our countries. And one of the things I would like to see is effectively an audit or a public debate about all the different agencies that are in the main fields and to what extent they do fit with the kind of incentive values compatibility that I espouse. You will find tomorrow when I talk about central banking that all this will turn out to be relevant. And the whole point of my project is that central banking is rarely talked about in those terms, except on the political fringes. And I think central banks are so powerful that it's not enough for debates about them and their powers and what will work and what won't work to be confined to technocratic specialists in central banks, treasuries, economics departments, and finance departments. I think we have to debate the powers that we have in the light of the kind of things I've been discussing for the past 2 days. Tomorrow's lecture will be completely different. It will be about central banking. Thank you. Time for some questions, if any. I suspect that if I was speaking in the law faculty, I would now be drowned with questions that I haven't quite appreciated the subtlety of what was said in. I've exhausted a business school audience.
Thank you again for today's lecture. I was intrigued by the part where you talked about the clash between the incentives and values, or the need to have the compatibility between the incentives and values for agencies. But I wasn't sure I quite followed these specific examples and where that conflict came into play, and I wondered if you could flesh those out.
I think that sometimes Congress will delegate functions with vague objectives and essentially hand over the lawmaking power to unelected officials. High policy is made, whether in semi-independent agencies or in fully independent agencies, by people that we haven't elected, and they're not constrained. They end up deciding what public policy is. Now, they might, as a matter of expediency, be a bit sensitive to public opinion, but they might not. And I think that takes a risk with allegiance to our system of government. Actually, I think arguably it's a little bit worse than that here. I think, given the incentives set up by the Constitution, that the cooperation that you saw across the aisle for many decades was plainly an equilibrium, but I don't think it was a stable equilibrium. Well, it plainly wasn't, because we're no longer in it. Whereas I think the non-cooperative world that we're in now may well be a stable equilibrium, because it gets accompanied by gerrymandering and all sorts of other things that lock in non-cooperation across the aisle and between Congress and President. And so you end up in a world where, as I said yesterday, the marginal lawmaker is a judge or a regulator. And this is not filling in the details or exercising discretion within a clear mandate. It's go forth in field F and do good, pursue the public interest. Well, that's not what our forebears struggled for democracy for. It's behind you. Okay, Luigi.
Two questions. One, can you elaborate a bit what is value compatibility means in terms of an example of something that is value compatible or not? And two, can you give a more specific example, maybe you gave and I missed it, but about a situation in which you basically cannot write down a principle, and so something should be under full political control?
So a classic example of the second would be foreign policy. We wouldn't dream of delegating foreign policy to unelected officials, because we wouldn't be able to write down a mandate that was sufficiently rich and would take account of changes in the world. And yet we know foreign policy affects our way of life and our welfare absolutely enormously. So
the UK are probably better than the US in this, because you have a foreign affair department, which is very sophisticated. So there is a lot of technical competence. In the US, the ambassadors are basically political cronies, so they're not really sophisticated people. But in the UK, your ambassadors are trained and technical people. But they are subject to direct political control.
Well, they advise elected politicians, and it's the elected politicians that decide the thrust of foreign policy. If anything, you could put it the other way round, in that one of the interesting, this is not central to my subject, one of the interesting things about the US government system is, of course, no one in the executive branch other than the president has been elected. And so the president is essentially surrounded by unelected helpers. And when government was small, presidential wishes were plausibly direct from the president to the helpers. In today's world, they go via intermediaries, who they can't consult the president, any president, on everything. But the intermediaries have rarely knocked on doors. I don't know whether you use that expression here. My experience of dealing with British politicians is that people that knock on doors, however smart they are technically, they are different. There is something inside them where they're seeking to kind of tune in to the people. So I think there is there are really interesting questions about the structure of the executive branch here. On values compatibility, of course, it's less formal than incentives compatibility, which is kind of what lies behind your question. And furthermore, as I said yesterday, I don't think that our values are kind of monolithic. But nevertheless, there are kind of mainstream views about what democracy requires and is, and why it's warranted, and the rule of law and constitutionalism. And one of them, which kind of spans all three of those, is high policy, things that affect who we are and who we're going to become as political communities should be decided by the people that we represent, so that we have a say. The people have a say, and when the people we elect get it wrong, horribly wrong, they've taken a stand the wrong course, we can throw them out. And that's just not true of unelected people. We don't want the really big issues of politics decided by unelected people because they are insulated from politics. They may bend to politics as a matter of fact, but they may not, and sometimes do not. So we have to be very careful about that. But if you said to me I should formalize values compatibility more than I have, I think that would be a reasonable challenge. And I guess my position amounts to that something could be incentive compatible, and yet at odds with a more or less common sense assessment of who we are meant to be as a political community, how we think of ourselves as a political community.
You know, I like very much the term. I'm just struggling to implement and understand also what constraints it puts differently in different countries, because in coming from the UK, from Europe, the idea that a judge can be thrown away based on his decisions is completely outside of my values. But in the United States, this is standard. There are a lot of places where judges are elected.
Well, I was talking about the federal courts, and that wouldn't be true of the federal courts, and it certainly wouldn't be true of the appeal courts, and even less of the Supreme courts. Instead, as everybody in the room knows, lots of political decisions end up in the Supreme Court, and given their tenure, it creates incentives to persist until the last moment of life. There was a question at the back.
I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned that the incompatibility between securities regulation and financial supervision might be, if I understood correctly, something that is going to show up in the next crisis. Do you think that is more related to the institutional arrangements or the relative competence of each agency? And I'm thinking of 0809 and the relative incompetence that the SEC proved or demonstrated in regulating large banks.
So just on the last thing, I don't think you'll find any of the agencies on either side of the Atlantic, central banking, prudential regulation, or securities regulation, who are competing to make claims for their competence in the run-up to the crisis. And that's the kind of burden that a whole generation of public officials carries. The reason I think this matters, and for this audience, I would be kind of more concrete. We live in a world where as banking has been re-regulated, well, de jure banks have been re-regulated, so there are incentives to shift more out of de jure banks into vehicles and structures and funds that sometimes, not always, share the same structure as banking and the inherent fragility of banking, essentially funded by short-term claims that can run, invested in opaque and liquid assets. And were that true, this is the so-called shadow banking problem, if that's true, and it seems to be true, then we should expect eventually that there will be some kind of shadow banking crisis. And yet there have not been general policies designed to make shadow banking as a whole more resilient. There have been policies in this country and elsewhere designed to make particular parts of shadow banking a bit more resilient, perhaps particularly so with money market mutual funds, where there have been some reforms. Didn't go as far as I personally would have liked, but there were reforms. So you then have that, and then you say, well, do you get up in the morning in the SEC or wherever with an incentive to deal with this? Well, you certainly haven't got an unambiguous mandate to pursue it. There was a former SEC commissioner, who I'm not going to name, a professional friend of mine, who made speeches saying that the SEC didn't have any mandate for financial stability at all. I personally think that's wrong. I think if you look at Section 2 of the 1934 Act, it does provide a basis for the SEC pursuing financial stability. But even if that's right, it has to trade it off against these other things. Whereas on my precepts, stability regulator trade-offs would be made in advance by the legislature, and they would simply pursue a standard of resilience. Why does this matter? In the colloquial expression, you cannot expect a non-independent agency to take away the punch bowl. If the next boom is in shadow banking and you're running the SEC and you could do something about it, but if doing something about it was really unpopular, you're going to get your budget cut. And you might want a big budget to look important. I'm less persuaded of that than most political scientists. My view is that when you have lots of power, you don't necessarily need more budget to kind of make you feel important. But even if that's not true, Congress could take away the powers that you need to lean against the bubble, because Congress can defund that particular part of your organization. It's incredible, actually. I don't mean incredible bad or incredibly good. The annual appropriations process is essentially an annual re-legislation of mandates, because there can be effectively prescriptions and proscriptions for what you should do. So Congress finds it hard to pass laws, but by passing a budgetary law each year, an appropriations law, it effectively relitigates every mission. Well, that's not what you want to do, to stick to a stable course. So yes, I worry about this. I've told the US story, but it would be a variant of it would be true in Europe. There was a question there, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how regulatory capture by an industry factors into this framework that you have in terms of the relative autonomy from elected representatives.
Yeah.
And, like, for instance, would an agency that's more under the control of politicians be more insulated from an industry, from lobbying or undue influence from an industry? Thanks.
No, thank you for raising that, because it's been a kind of striking omission of anything I've said in the past 2 days, partly because Luigi has me giving a keynote lecture on the political economy of finance on Thursday evening, so I was going to say something about that then. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, although I've talked about independence from day-to-day politics, actually an independent agency must be independent from the industry and all sectional interests. And big picture, I think the structure of the remedy is the same, so that having a clear and monitorable objective is incredibly important to do that, so that when you're, which kind of, I don't want to say prevents, but makes it more difficult for you as a policymaker to shade the policy in favor of a particular sectional interest, say the industry, because everybody on that side, you're the industry, that's the public and commentators, they can see that I'm no longer actually trying to pursue the monitorable objective that I was given. I also think this goes to, in an independent agency, it goes to terms of office and restrictions on what you can do when you leave office. I mean, these agencies, particularly the agencies I'm going to talk about tomorrow at central banks, they are very powerful. I mean, I have no doubt they are very, very powerful. And one of the things I think that we've evolved to a norm in the judiciary where you serve late. On either side of the Atlantic, in any of the countries, you serve late, and it will be at the top of courts, and it will be your last job. And there's no question of you going off to something else that might be interesting and may remunerate you well, or whatever, but conflicted afterwards, because you're old, and because the norm is that you won't. And in a sense, I would like to see central bank boards migrate over time. This could only be a norm. I don't think it could be a soft norm. I don't think it could be a law, to old people who are in their last job, for whom there's no question that they're going to pop up somewhere else afterwards. I think with independent agencies that aren't independent, it's different. It's precisely because they're under some degree of day-to-day political leverage or control. Well, capture can occur at two levels. Even if you did all what I just described for the regulatory policymakers, well, their sponsors in Congress or Parliament could be captured, and they have real power. So, in a sense, by deciding an agency should be independent, and I'm now going to express it entirely in terms of regulatory capture, we are deciding that we do not want regulatory capture. Whereas when we decide that an agency is only semi-independent and not independent at all, we're accepting that there will be regulatory capture. And this, of course, is tremendously important for what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. There are some people that hold, let me say this now actually, there are some people that hold that it would be okay for a central bank to be independent in monetary policy and not independent in its regulatory or supervisory functions. Certainly Stan Fisher used to hold this view. And I don't know whether he still does, but he certainly did. And I disagree with him about that. The nature of politics, if I have two functions, one is independent and the other one is not independent, the nature of politics, the nature of politicians and the mandarins around them, or whatever you would call them here in other countries, is that they will use their leverage where you formally need them to extract something that they would like on the thing where you are formally insulated. And that this would be, in some countries, this would be done in ways that were invisible other than to the super cognoscenti. So I think if we have multiple functions in an agency, like an independent agency, like a central bank or other agencies, then all of those functions should be independent, and therefore they all need to meet the criteria that I've set out. And so I think banking supervision can meet the criteria, as I'll discuss tomorrow, but if it can't, then I do not favour bank supervision being inside central banks. I think that's a bit of a problem given the lender of last resort function. So I think that narrowing the supervisory function to something where we can meet the criteria for delegating to an independent agency is of first order importance. Because if we put a non-independent function in the central bank, expect it to affect monetary policy in fast motion or slow motion.
I think I've sort of got almost the opposite question to one of the ones that Luigi made. It strikes me that it's sometimes difficult to actually put on a precise mandate. So an inflation target is one thing, but trying to define what financial stability means and trying to say, I mean, it's quite easy ex post to say crisis occurred, but how do you monitor financial stability, especially if things are stored away in tail risks?
So my solution, which I will outline tomorrow, will be not to define neither financial stability nor financial instability, but instead to try and get out part of what we really care about and something that we probably can define, which will be resilience. But that will leave out some things. But yeah, exactly. So in a sense, you've been very patient these last 2 days. I've talked about all sorts of things that are going to seem distant from your real concerns, which we'll get to, or real interests, which we'll get to tomorrow. But my answers, and these are answers that have actually been implemented more or less in one country, are driven by what I've been talking about. So people were surprised when I said, well, I don't think we should try to define financial stability or instability. Don't remotely know how, and we don't need to for a function that could decently be delegated to us, as I then was. But I'll try to say more about that tomorrow. Doug?
So related to your two goals, or one political, one non-political, does this have anything to say about whether monetary policy should consider financial stability? That when you have an influence on it?
Yeah, it does. It does. So this is an exaggeration of what I think and say in the book. I think more or less it means that monetary policy should stay out of trying to lean against credit booms and asset price booms that do not presage nominal demand outstripping supply and putting upward pressure on inflation. And essentially that's because I kind of allude to the kind of Borio position in Basel. And I've said this to them, they too are professional friends. So how are you going to frame this in a way where we can monitor, A, whether the central bank is even trying, because they may say they are or say they're not, but so it's not enough, we can't go just by what they say. And then if they are trying, whether or not they're succeeding. And if that could be done, I think what I'm saying goes for regulatory policy in the hands of central bankers as well as monetary policy. But more generally for monetary policy, keeping the objective as simple as possible, I think has been tremendously important. I know you're not going to be here tomorrow, so let me say this. I think this is a merit of inflation targeting relative to money targeting. So the problem with money targeting is it was even if technically it had merit, it was incomprehensible to the people. I mean, I can remember living in a world where a money target of say 7% would be set, and then there would be a shift in the demand for money, and we or the Treasury would say to the public, so the target's now 10%, but that's because 7's now 10. It's not because we've changed the target. It's because 7's now 10. And whereas, and also the with money targeting, typically the instrument and the objective aren't separated. It's just we will certainly base money targeting. It's just we will just expand the supply of base money on the following path. The instrument is the objective. One of the things I like about inflation targeting is that the objective, the output, an inflation rate is something that gets reported on the news, television news, and most people can understand without understanding how the index is compiled. When they go to the shops, they say, bloody hell, costs seem to be going up, prices seem to be going up a lot. I like that a lot. And the instrument, an interest rate, it flows through pretty quickly, particularly in countries with floating rate mortgages, but even without, it flows through pretty quickly into things that people care about, how much they're paying on their mortgage, how much they're receiving on their savings, if they're lucky enough to have any savings. And I think those salient things are tremendously important from where I'm coming from. So technically, I for two reasons, I have reservations about price level targeting, or even Ben's version of that. And that's because in price level targeting, it has some of the same hazards, not for the same reason as the old money targeting, which is, we want price level on average to go, but let's say 2%. But there's some cost shocks, and it goes up at 5%. And so although next year it's going to be minus 3% or 1%, and I think the public find it, and not just as citizens, but as wage bargainers, would find that harder to comprehend. There's another point here as well, which I'll touch on more tomorrow, which is, I think it's very important that the unelected central bank doesn't choose the inflation target. So that there's a debate now about, for good reasons, whether the inflation target should be increased from say 2 to say 4. Obviously, Olivier has been advancing. Olivier Blanchard, former of the chief economist of the IMF, has been advancing that. And let's assume that that's a great idea. I'm not convinced it is in terms of positive economics, but let's assume that it is. I don't think the central bank should decide, because if it's announced, then it's immediately credible. There's kind of price level shift, so there are kind of shifts in resources from that side of the room to this side of the room, and the ongoing taxation on monetary assets has changed as well. So it's an instrument. I'm going to talk tomorrow about monetary policy is always an instrument, latently an instrument of taxation. And we decided a long time ago, in my country, I think in the 13th century, but that's, its popularity has spread over time, that these taxation questions should be taken by legislators. But let me bring it back to what I was saying today about incentives. Well, do I expect that Congress itself would intervene in that? That's not realistic. And I thought it was a very good thing when Ben Bernanke, when he was chair of the Fed, led the Fed to articulate what they meant by how they interpreted price stability in the Federal Reserve Act and maximum sustainable unemployment. What I think they should have done normatively is promote public debate on that. And when I've suggested this, friends of mine who were in the Fed during that period said, well, we did talk to members of Congress privately. And I said, no, publicly. You have to, for people to accept this, you have to do it publicly. And I think the gap between me and other members of my tribe on these issues is a difference in the assessment of the risk of opaque government by technocrats. And some people think there isn't any risk on that. All that matters is short-term welfare. And I don't think that's true, essentially because I think my tribe will always eventually screw up. And I think we then need, those of them that remain in office, need the support and acquiescence of the public. Thank you very much.